Hello, warm welcome to the programme. It will take several days to develop a full picture of the devastation across Turkey and northwest Syria, but it's highly likely the death toll, which now stands at more than 3,500, will rise. The first earthquake of 7.8 magnitude struck at 4:20 this morning while most people were still in their beds, 20 miles from the city of Gaziantep. Note the time strap on the footage from this security camera. The shelves rattled continuously for over 40 seconds. And that gives you a fair idea of what was happening outside. The emergency teams say at least 3,000 buildings have collapsed across 8 provinces in Turkey. Here's the before and after at the Gaziantep castle. Walls that have stood for over 1,500 years. In daylight, the badly damaged housing blocks were still falling. This one in Urfa. And then came a second earthquake, 9 hours later. This one 7.5 magnitude along the same fault line, but 60 miles further to the north. 7.5 would be a massive earthquake in and of itself. The radius of the zone affected stretches some 400 miles, so the challenge for the search and rescue teams is monumental, particularly in northwest Syria, where the infrastructure was already in fragile state after years of airstrikes and bombardment. There have been over 538 deaths in government-held territory, Aleppo, Hama, Latakia, Tartus, and another 400 in the last opposition-held enclave centred in Idlib province. The Syrian army has been deployed, but not to Idlib. They are very much on their own. We're joined tonight by Ahmed Behram from the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is among the aid groups providing support, and Professor Mike Steckler. He's a geophysicist from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University of New York. Welcome to you both. Ahmed, can I talk to you first? There are always 3 factors in an earthquake. There's the depth and the location of an earthquake, there's the magnitude of the earthquake, and of course there is the time. And on all 3 measures, this could not have been worse.
Okay. Good evening. It couldn't. I mean, it's come at the worst time, after midnight, 4 a.m. It's come in the worst possible season. We have just arrived at a powerful snowstorm in northern Syria, for example. And it come after 12 years of struggle, of suffering, of hardship, of poverty, and it's a whole catalogue of factors that have just basically destroyed the little hope that people in those areas thought that they had to restart a life decimated in 12 years of conflict in Syria.
As you suggest, it is particularly hard in northwest Syria, and in an area in Idlib province where there is very, very, very little help at all. In political terms, what do you, as a refugee agency, as an aid agency, what do you need from President Assad?
What we need from the not just the Syrian government, but the whole world, we need immediate support. We need all assistance to be thrown at this. This is a moment that Syrians have described as doomsday scenario. This is the end of the world for them. It's apocalyptic almost. We need the world to stand behind these people. We need the full weight of the world, that the exemplary support that we have seen in places, humanitarian support that we have seen in places like Ukraine and Afghanistan. We need that replicated. And let's be clear, every minute that we are losing, every minute, every day, every week, we are losing more lives. We are losing lives that have survived for 12 years, people in their shelters. Their shelters, you talk about, monuments that have stood there for 1,500 years. These fragile structures, survived 12 years of bombing, explosions, all sorts of it. They couldn't, survive a 40 seconds of an earthquake that has, killed, displaced, and injured thousands and thousands.
Let's talk about the earthquake, Mike, because I know you've been studying this particular fault line for some for some years now. What do you think happened?
Well, what's happening in the area is that all of Arabia is moving north into Turkey, and Turkey is being pushed out west. And Turkey is being bordered by the North Anatolian Fault, which I've been studying, and the East Anatolian Fault. And this earthquake was along the East Anatolian Fault, which has not had a large earthquake like this for quite a while. So the strain has been building up and finally gave way. And this was a very large earthquake for this kind of sliding, what we call strike-slip earthquake.
Right. Can you explain to me, because the second earthquake was 7.5 on the Richter scale, is the difference between 7.5 and 7.8 greater than the difference between 6.5 and 6.8?
Well, it's a logarithmic scale, so it's a multiplicative factor. So, the difference of 0.3 in the Richter scale corresponds to probably about 3 times the size in terms of energy.
Right. So when we're talking about 0.3, you would feel an enormous difference between that second earthquake and the first one, but it just shows you how big the first one would have been.
Right. The first one was quite large. It stretched for probably about 150 kilometers along the fault, and went down to 30 or 40 kilometers, which is quite deep for a strike-slip earthquake, and so that contributed to the larger size. It also looks like the second earthquake was probably not on the same fault, but on a slightly different fault with a slightly different orientation. But when a large earthquake happens and moves the earth by meters, it puts stress on the adjacent faults, and so we see large aftershocks like that, and we'll continue to see large aftershocks for the next weeks and even months, slowly decreasing in size as the Earth readjusts to the new positions of the places on either side of the fault.
Well, just quickly on that specific issue, because we've got lots of search teams out tonight on very fragile structures, on piles of rubble. Already we've had 30 aftershocks. Is there any way that you as a geophysicist can advise on how long that process is likely to continue?
I would say it can continue for several months. And there are some rough rules of thumbs about how quickly they tend to decay, so that as the aftershocks continue, they will tend to be smaller and eventually get less frequent.
Right. David, I think Ahmed already touched on it. The reality right now is that there are so many demands on international aid. Ukraine, of course, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the problems in Somalia, not to mention tighter government budgets. How concerned would you be that past the initial search and rescue, that resources internationally to deal with this will start to dry up?
Well, I think that's a real problem. I was struck by watching Elise Doucette's amazing report from northern Syria earlier, that our entire political and media world is so nationalistic. We look at borders between countries. These events, of course, don't respect any of those false political borders we put between countries, and we're just not capable of making quick decisions to get the help to the people that we need to, irrespective of the financial element.
And I was just thinking to that building that we saw there in Urfa, several hours after the earthquake, that comes down and you see traffic going past the building. There's no rhyme or reason to which buildings come down, and mentally that takes an enormous toll on a community.
It'll remind Americans of 9/11 when those buildings came down, that it was a very similar in the close proximity of those buildings. But of course, I don't think any of us in the West have any understanding really of the scale of this. No. It'll be interesting, in the US, give it 48 hours, it will probably drop out of the media. Here in the UK, a little bit longer because of the BBC's coverage. But that's the real problem. The real problem is how quickly this drops away from the consciousness in the West.
I remember covering the tsunami, Marianne, and I was in Indonesia, in Banda Aceh, And it really does start to play on your mind, the aftershocks. In fact, I literally was waking up at night thinking I was in an aftershock. It's mentally, it's exhausting for people who of course don't know whether they can go back to their homes, whether they can ever go back to their homes, and of course might be on some of these building sites trying to find loved ones and neighbours and friends.
And that's on top of the fact that people who live there now were struggling every day to begin with. I mean, this is a gargantuan problem. It's a catastrophe on top of a tragedy, on top of a disaster. And to hold the public's attention, let alone get the resources to them, is a huge task, but it has to be done. And I know the United States has already sent search teams. I know they're sending other resources. And I have to say, one of the many things Zelensky has done so well with Ukraine is to keep it in front of people, to keep it in front of the media. And Turkey, Syria, and the other areas that were affected by this have to find some way to do the same, even though it's our responsibility as global citizens to help these people that need everything and everybody. And even then, it's hard to imagine it would make a dent in this.
Ahmed, how difficult will it be just getting aid into northern Syria? Because obviously there's only one corridor in, and that comes through Turkey. And we're looking at some of the roads, some of the pictures of the roads, and there's extensive damage.
Indeed. I mean, they had been already. I mean, we started talking about this obviously weeks ago with the onset of the winter crisis. Only last week, we had a massive storm started across the region, including in areas around Syria. Of course, the weather is going to make it much more complicated for all of us. But we are on the ground as an agency, as an aid agency, and we are. Within these communities, whether that is in Aleppo, in Hama, in Idlib, across Syrian territories, we are on standby. Of course, we let rescuers do their job, and we don't overlap. But we will, our role is gonna follow through. And of course, it is vital that we mobilize resources, and that that should come from powerful nations that have the tools, that have the resources. They just need the will. We just need a political will here. We need an international will to mobilize resources. We have people who are embedded in these communities, we're talking about our staff, our colleagues are on the ground, very close from the scene. They themselves have been affected, of course, like everyone else, but. We are ready to do our job. We just need the support. And as your guests have mentioned, I mean, sadly, it takes a disaster for the world to turn its attention to the Middle East. It takes a disaster in Lebanon to someone to wake up and then understand there's a disaster there. Same in Syria. So it is difficult, but it's not impossible. And
just on that issue, Marianne, I mean, there is a complicating geopolitical factor here. Of course, Russia is working with Syria, northwest Syria, and of course, America would work with its NATO partner, Turkey. But how difficult will it be for the likes of USAID to go in and help people in Idlib province or in Aleppo or wherever it is in northwest Syria?
Well, I think the statement was already made. It takes political will. And these are human beings. There are fellow citizens around the world. We can't allow politics to define these things, just like earthquakes don't respect any borders. We have to help people. And it's incumbent upon the United States, who always takes the lead in many of these things, to marshal the will of the people around the world, the countries around the world, to help here, because it is needed. And it is going to be needed for a long time. So it has to be done.
Ahmed Bayram and Mike Steckler, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts this evening. And of course, we will keep you up to date with any developments that we hear in Turkey, those rescue efforts continuing through the night.